Hello class, today we're going to be going over the chain, product, and quotient rules. These three rules are going to help us take the derivatives of some equations that look a little more difficult and that we might not be able to do with just the power rule. So let's go ahead and get started with the chain rule. So the chain rule we apply to functions where we're taking the derivative, where the function looks something like this. F composed of g of x. So when we're taking the derivative of a function that looks like f composed of g of x, this is going to turn the derivative out to be f primes of g of x times g primes of x. So what we're doing is we're taking the derivative of our f of x function while keeping g of x inside and then multiplying that whole thing by the derivative of g primes of x. So what it looks like, we'll do a quick example here. If we want to take the derivative of cosine of x squared, we're going to identify both of these functions. So we have our f of x is going to be our cosine of x, and our g of x is going to be our x squared. So if we need to find f primes of g of x, we're going to take the derivative of cosine of x, which is going to be negative sine of x, and then keep the g of x inside, which we know is x squared, so that's going to turn out to be negative sine of x squared times the derivative of g of x, which we know is x squared, and using our power rule, we know that x squared, the derivative of that is 2x. So let's go on to a more formal example here. If we wanted to find the derivative of y equals sine of cosine of x, we're going to have to use the chain rule. So first, let's just set up our little problem here, dy dx of sine of cosine of x. So let's identify what our f of x and our g of x are. So it looks like our f of x, whatever is on the outside here, could be sine of x. Whatever is on the inside of that sine, or what the function we plug in for the x in sine of x is going to be cosine of x. So as we can see here, if we have our f of x of sine of x and g of x is cosine of x, if we were to plug cosine of x into sine of x, we're going to get this back, which is going to be f primes of g of x, or excuse me, f of g of x. So let's take the derivative of both of these things. The derivative of sine of x you should know is cosine of x, and the derivative of cosine of x you should know is negative sine of x. And we have those right here. So the chain rule says that the derivative of any function f of g of x equals the f primes of g of x times g primes of x. So we have all of these things right here, so we can go ahead and just plug all of these things in. We know that f primes of x is cosine of x, and we want to plug g of x into that cosine, which we know is cosine, and then multiply it by g primes of x, which we know is negative sine of x. So if we plug that all in, we should get that y prime is equal to cosine of x times the negative sine of x. Right, so we're just taking what we know and plugging it all in. Let's move on to the product rule. So when we want to use the product rule, we will use this when we want to take the derivative of two functions that are being multiplied together. So just like here, if we have dy dx of f of x times g of x, it'll turn out to be like this. So we'll have f of x times the derivative of g of x plus g of x times the derivative of f of x. And we have a little helpful saying right here to remember that. If we say that f of x is 1 and g of x is 2, then we know that 1 d2, so d stands for derivative, plus 2 d1 is going to be the product rule. Okay, so 1 d2 plus 2 d1. So if we can apply that to this next example, we want to find the derivative of y equals 3x cubed times sine of x. So we'll set up our little derivative here, just like we did the last problem, and we want to identify which is our f of x and which is our g of x. So we have two functions of x being multiplied together. It looks like we could say that this is our f of x, and this is our g of x. Yeah? So let's scroll that down here. We know f of x is 3x cubed, and g of x is sine of x. So now we want to take the derivative of both of these things. We know that with our power rule, we can bring this 3 down in front and subtract the power by 1, so we should have 3 times 3 of x squared, which should be 9x squared. And we know that the derivative of sine of x should be cosine of x, right? So we have these two things here. So just like the last problem, we want to plug this in for what we already know. So we know that this is 1d2 plus 2d1, which is the same as this, 1d2 plus 2d1. And we know all of this stuff up here, and we can go ahead and just plug it right in. So we know f of x is 3x cubed, g primes of x is cosine of x, plus g of x, which is sine of x, times f primes of x, which is 9x squared. And we have that right here. Y prime equals 3x cubed times cosine of x plus sine of x times 9x squared. Cool, cool. Simple enough. Now let's go on to the quotient rule. So the quotient rule is when we are going to take the derivative of one function of x over another function of x. And when we do that, we're going to have this. So if we have f of x over g of x, the derivative of that is going to equal g of x times f primes of x minus f of x times g primes of x all over g of x squared. So we have another saying for the quotient rule to help us remember what that is. And so if we have f of x, which is our higher function, so this is our high, right, because it's on top, and g of x, which is our lower function, so that's low because it's on bottom, then our helpful saying tells us low d high, and remember d is for derivative, minus, and minus is important to remember, high d low, all over the square of what's below. And remember that whatever is below, it's going to be g of x squared, not g primes of x, but the original g of x. Okay, so let's apply that to this example here. Find the derivative of y equals x squared over sine of x. Set that up as a derivative once again. And we want to identify what our f of x is and what our g of x is. This one's pretty simple since we have one on the top and one on the bottom. So our f of x is going to be x squared, and our g of x is going to be sine of x. And so remember, this is the high function, and this is the low function. So let's take the derivative of both of these things. F of x, we can just use the power rule. Bring the 2 down, subtract the power by 1, and that should be 2 of x. And you should know that the derivative of sine of x is going to be cosine of x. Okay, so we have those things here. Now let's recall our helpful saying, low d high minus high d low all over the square of what's below. And we can just plug each of these things that we know once again in for our derivative. So if we have low d high, that's going to be sine times the derivative of f of x, which is 2x, minus high d low, which is x squared times cosine of x, all over the square of what's below, which we know is sine of x, so sine squared of x, and this is our derivative. Alright, so now that we know a little bit more about the chain rule, the product rule, and the quotient rule, we will be working a little bit more on these for the next class period, so make sure you're familiar with these so we can do a little bit of practice. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class.